Let's start with John chapter 17, verse 16. Jesus is about to be betrayed, and he's with his disciples around the table for the Last Supper, and he tells them a lot of things, like that he's going away, and then he prays to God, and this section of John is from that prayer. So in John chapter 17, verse 16, Jesus says, "They," that's his disciples, "do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Make them holy in the truth. Your word is truth. And as you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sakes I make myself holy, so that they also may be holy in the truth. I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me." Let's take this verse by verse real quick. So verse 16, what Jesus is saying there is we belong to God for God's possession and for his use. We don't belong to others for their projects, for their judgment, for their rules, and we don't belong to ourselves for our own ambitions or as slaves to our own fear. We belong to God, and verse 17, because we belong to God for his possession and for his use, we are holy. And verse 18, Jesus says, "As you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world," and that's what holiness is. Holiness means to be sent into the world to do what Jesus did. Verse 19, Jesus makes himself holy by dying in submission to God's will for the salvation of the world, so that we can be holy by following Jesus into his sacrifice for others and into his service of other people. And then verse 20, I included this because it includes us. That mission of holiness isn't just for the original disciples who were there with Jesus around the table. It's for all of us who share in their experience, even all the way around the world and even 2,000 years later. Because Jesus says, "I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word." That's us. And what that means is that we get to share in the same holy relationship with God that Jesus had. God in us in God, for the salvation of the world, and that's holiness. So that all brings us to a really serious question, and the question is, if holiness for us is to share in Jesus' work and to share in that relationship with God that Jesus had, what did Jesus actually do? And another way to ask that question is, what's our job then? What are we sent into the world to do? And like I said, like I warned you, Jesus got pretty dirty doing it, which means that we're going to have to get pretty dirty doing this too. The first thing that we're going to talk about, the first thing that Jesus came into the world to do, we're going to talk about this tonight, and there's some other things next week. But Jesus came into the world and entered into the worst pain imaginable, the worst pain that the world had to offer, and he bore that pain with us. Not just by dying on the cross. Jesus was a compassionate human being. We see marks of that all throughout the gospel. And Jesus walked around with crowds full of people whose bodies were broken, who had been abused, who had been hurt, who had had loved ones killed, who were oppressed, who were poor. And Jesus was with those people every single day. And as a compassionate human being, he carried that pain, the pain of his people, as he walked among them and as he taught them and as he healed them. And so Jesus found the pain of the world in the crowd that followed him around. The question for us today is, where do we find the pain of the world, and how do we bear that with the people who are suffering? So there's some obvious places to find pain. We could go to like the immigrant holding centers that are here in town, where there are minors who have been separated from their families and are being kept, in conditions that aren't always that great, and there's obviously pain there. You can go to the Mujeres Unidas shelter for women who've been abused by their husbands or by their boyfriends. And I've been there, and there's pain there. You could go to a cemetery, and you could see people weeping over the graves of the loved ones that they've lost, and there's obviously pain there. You can go to the hospital, and you can see people at the hospital who are suffering from wounds and from disease. There's obviously pain there. You could come to our church on any weekday, And Allison, I'll tell you, once in a while, we just have people show up from the community on like a Tuesday at 1 in the afternoon, and they want to be in the sanctuary, and they want to pray, or they want to talk to a pastor, they want to talk to Allison. And when you get down to the bottom of what they're going through, and they're weeping, and they're telling you their story, a lot of it is pretty awful. A lot of people have been through a lot of things that are pretty terrible. And so those places, the jail, those are the obvious places where there's pain in the world. But you can also find pain in this world just by like talking to your nephew whose parents are splitting up. Or by talking to your friend from work who's like barely holding their mental health together. Or by talking to your sister who just lost her job and they're not sure how they're going to take care of their house payment next month. Or by talking to your husband or your wife about how they're worried about their parents or their grandparents as they're getting older. I've had people surprise me with their pain over coffee, or while we were goofing around and watching a movie, playing video games, or driving in the car. Or you say, hey, how you doing? And they say, not great. And you say, why don't you tell me about that? And it's like, whoa, I had no idea. Because all the pain of the world that Jesus came to bear with us, it's all right there in all of us, right beneath the surface. We are in pain. And the people around us are in pain. And what Jesus shows us by coming and by carrying that pain and by bearing it with us is that it's actually a very holy thing to share your pain with somebody else, or to share someone else's pain with them and to bear it together, because that's what Jesus did for us. Now we're going to get to the dirty part. We're going to get to the practical part. How do we bear each other's pain? I'm going to use a hospital visit as an example because I've been on both sides of that. I've been the pastor going to the hospital to visit someone who's in pain, who's suffering, who's sick, somebody with a terminal diagnosis who's not going to make it. And I've also been in the hospital bed as the patient, and I've had people come visit me. And so I know that particular pain from both sides. And first, before I tell you how we can do this, I need to tell you what doesn't work when you go to the hospital to visit somebody. And this could apply to just the conversation with a friend that you're having over coffee when they open up about their pain, but we're using the hospital visit as an example. So the first thing that doesn't work is when somebody walks into a hospital room and they want points for being there. You can tell people want points for being there when they explain to the person who's sick how difficult it was for them to come. Sometimes they'll say, oh man, I didn't want to come today because I don't like hospitals. You know who doesn't like hospitals? The people in the hospital. They don't need you to tell them that you don't like hospitals because they don't like it either. And the reason that we do that, the reason we walk in there and we say, oh man, I had such a hard time finding parking. Or, oh man, I was really busy today and I had so much to do, but I figured I'd stop by and see how you're doing. The reason we do that, the reason we draw attention to ourselves when we're doing that is because a lot of people know that visiting somebody and sharing their pain and being compassionate toward them is a spiritual thing. And they know that they should do it. And they know that it's something that God wants from us. But a lot of us haven't grown to the point where we're not selfish about it. And so when we walk into that hospital room and we want somebody to recognize that we're there, that we're doing them a favor by coming to visit them, it's still about us, and we still want credit. And I've been in a hospital bed and had somebody walk into the room and tell me how hard it was for them to show up and visit me. And at that point you go, well, don't do me any favors. I understand that you're busy. I don't want to be here either. Go live your life. I don't know what you want. You want me to give you flowers for coming to see me? And so that just doesn't work. When somebody's suffering and we draw the attention to ourselves and we want the credit for being there. The next thing that doesn't work, and I've seen this a lot from both sides, is when somebody walks into a hospital room and they want to reassure themselves by forcing the sick person to tell them that they think that God has a plan. I've seen this. Somebody did it to me, okay? I was waiting to go into surgery. Somebody came to visit me, and they leaned over my bed and looked me directly in my eyes, and they said, you know this is all going to work out for good, right? You know God's trying to teach you something, right? You know God has a plan, right? And I was annoyed because I was nervous about my surgery. And what I wanted was for somebody to feel that nervousness with me and recognize what I was going through. I didn't want them to try to force that idea on me. But later when I thought about it, and as I got to know this person, I realized this person was very nervous themselves about whether or not God had a plan for things that were going on in their own life. And so what they were doing was they were trying to force that issue with me because they were insecure about their relationship with God. And whether or not you're secure in your relationship with God, when you go to visit somebody who's in pain or who's suffering or who's in the hospital, or you're there next to somebody listening to the stuff that they're going through, you don't have to try to force them in that moment to say, yes, I know that God has a plan. Because usually that's not what the person wants to do. Another thing that we do in that same vein, and this has happened to me too, people come along and they try to figure out what you did to deserve what's happening to you. I had a doctor do that to me. The doctor diagnosed me with something, and then he found out I was a pastor, and then he said, you're a pastor and you have this horrible disease. Well, you can't say you've always been perfect, right? And I was like, dude, this is not the time for that. Let me process this. Let me deal with it. Don't try to figure out why I deserve what I'm going through. Don't try to make me admit that. Don't try to make me prove my faith at the moment right before I go into surgery. What I need in that moment is somebody to come alongside and feel what I'm feeling. I don't need them to try to fix my feelings so that they can feel better about themselves. And I've seen a lot of Christian people do that. They go into a hospital room and they feel like their mission is to teach the person who's suffering to say with their mouth that God has a plan and everything's going to be okay. It's not the time for that. And the last thing that doesn't work is trying to fix whatever somebody's worried about. So you might come along and you might say, you just need to have faith. We knew a family in another town a long time ago where husband and wife, they were farmers, and they had a really terrible argument one morning over breakfast. And the farmer got on his four-wheeler to go across the field to get onto his equipment so he could farm. And a truck hit him, and he ended up in a coma. And so the last contact that his wife had with him was this horrible argument, and then he was in a coma. And he was in a coma for several years. And every day she would go to the hospital, and she'd sit by his bed while he was in the coma, and she would just pray for him to wake up. And their pastor from their church went and told her that the reason that he hadn't woken up yet was because she did not have enough faith. And if she had enough faith, then he would wake up. So on top of her feeling guilty about the argument that they'd had right before this terrible accident occurred, she also had to feel guilty about the fact that she didn't have enough faith. You're not God. And I'm not God. And so we can't step into a situation like that in somebody's life when they're suffering and they're struggling and just prescribe some answer, because we don't have the answer, and they don't need our silly Band-Aid solutions to their problems, because we really don't have the fix for it. Somebody who's struggling with their health doesn't need a sermon while they're in the hospital about how they need to take better care of themselves and how they need to eat better and how they need to exercise. Somebody who's struggling with like mental health and depression doesn't need someone to come along and say, well, you just need to get over it and have more faith and try harder and be positive. It's not how it works. I've even had people like say that they wanted to talk to me, ask me how I'm doing with my health, and then I explain it to them, and they say, yeah, what I wanted to talk to you about was this supplement that I sell. It's this special herb that nobody knows about, and it's proven to fix whatever's wrong with you. That doesn't help me. I need a friend. I need a companion. I need somebody to stand beside me and carry my burdens with me. And so when we do those things, when we want points for being there and we want the credit, when we need to reassure ourselves, when we try to fix what someone else is going through, when in any way we make their suffering about us somehow, that's not that holy work that Jesus called us to, and it's not what Jesus did. Let's talk about the better way to be there for somebody who's suffering. The first thing we have to do is we have to listen and empathize with how the person actually feels, and not try to force them into how we think they should feel or how we would feel in their circumstances. If you really want to care about somebody, you actually have to care about what's going on with them. And you can't just project your own life experiences and your own circumstances and your own history and your own feelings onto them and still expect to connect with them at a real level. You actually need to hear what the person has to say. You need to listen to them tell you what's wrong. And you might not think that what they're going through is like the worst thing you've heard all day, and it might not be as bad as things that you have gone through. I'm a student minister too, and so when I talk to students who are 14 or 15 and they tell me like their problems, you just kind of go, there's worse than this waiting for you, bud. But that's not what they need to hear. What they need to hear is, yeah, tell me more about how that makes you feel. Tell me more about how the people being mean to you at high school, how that affects your self-image or whatever. They don't have your experience. No one has your experience, and we don't have their experience. And so if we're ever going to actually work compassionately with somebody, you need to actually make room for them to tell you what they're going through and try to understand it through their eyes and in their position and in their circumstances. The next thing we have to do is we need to ask them deeper questions so that we can understand more deeply why their pain is so difficult and what they're afraid or worried about. And we need to give them room so that they can say it all, so that we can get down to the truth of the matter. When I'm sick and things aren't working, it's not just the pain that bothers me. It's the fact that I have 2 young children. And I want to be around, and I want to be healthy, and I want to be there for them for as long as possible. And so the pain of an illness is nothing compared to that kind of existential pain about where is my life going? And a lot of times we don't want to go that deep with somebody. We don't want to actually get to the root problem that's causing their distress. We want to talk about the surface issues, the reason they're in the hospital. But we don't want to give room for them to really express what's going on in their heart. Because when we do that, now we're stuck. Now we're on the hook. Now we're attached. Now we're with them in it. Another thing that we have to resist is just giving people that God answer. Yeah, that sounds really terrible that all these things happen to you, but I'm sure God has everything under control. We don't have to represent God to people who are suffering. What people who are suffering need, and I know this from personal experience, is someone to sit beside them and go to God with them and ask for help. Not to represent God on God's behalf and try to explain to the person why everything God does is good. I don't need that. I need somebody to stand beside me and say, you know what, this is horrible and it doesn't seem fair, and I can tell you're really suffering, and I'm going to sit by you and I'm going to pray to God with you that God will come through for you. That's all I need. I need another human being. I don't need some messenger from God. When we're suffering, our relationship with God is already complicated enough as it is without somebody else butting in. And the last thing that anybody can do without any kind of training and without even really thinking about it, and especially without talking, is you can just be there for somebody, just so that they know from the presence of another human being that they don't have to go through what they're going through alone. In the book of Job in the Bible, a bunch of really serious disasters happen to Job. He loses all of his money, he loses all of his stuff, and he loses his children. Then he breaks out in sores, and he sits down in the dirt, and he starts scraping those sores off of his skin. And he's got 4 friends who show up and sit next to him for 7 days without saying anything. And that was just the perfect response. This guy Job lost everything. Let's sit beside him in the dirt so he knows he's not alone. And then they blew it. Because after they sat next to him for 7 days, they started to try to explain to him why those terrible things had happened to him. And it just made Job more and more and more frustrated, till the point where he wishes that he'd never been born. And so, if you don't know what to do when somebody's suffering, but you want to help them bear their pain, sometimes you can just go show up and sit next to them when they're suffering. Or buy them a coffee and sit across the table from them and just let them tell you. Or send them a text message and ask, how are you doing? And then let them tell you. You don't have to say anything. Because just that little bit of reaching out and letting somebody share their pain with you is holy, because then they're not bearing their pain alone. Now, that kind of compassion is a sacrifice, and that's why it's so hard. Because what you're doing is you're dedicating a chunk of time to somebody that's not all about you. And most of us don't like to do that. We like to fill up the space with stories and little fun facts about ourselves. And if you say, well, I'm going to go listen to somebody for 30 minutes, that's hard. A lot of times our ego wants to steal the spotlight. The other reason it's a sacrifice is if you're a compassionate person at all and somebody starts telling you their pain, you might not want to hear it because you will probably feel their pain along with them, and that's uncomfortable. And as you feel their pain along with them, listening to somebody who's going through something terrible, that might make you face things that you'd rather not face, like your own mortality or the injustice of suffering. Especially if that person, if there's no resolution to their problem, you might leave going, oh man, life is really hard and bleak and difficult and unfair, and I'm not sure I wanted to think about that today. Well, that's why it's a sacrifice, because that person is going through it, and when you go through it with them, then you're bearing their pain. But just simply doing that, bearing someone's pain with them, and sharing your pain with someone who's open to that, that's holy. And it matters, and it's what Jesus calls us to do. Paul writes in Romans chapter 12, verse 15, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. So that means we're not supposed to go to people who are sad and make them feel happy and go to people who are happy and make them feel sad. We're supposed to figure out where that person is in their whole emotional range and then hang out with them for a while and let them set the tone. And having visited a lot of sick people in the hospital, I wish more Christians would do that. We get all stoked up in the car. Yeah, I bet that person's really sad right now. I'm going to bust in there and I'm going to make them feel happy. They don't need that. They need you to show up and read the room, figure out where it's at, and then participate with them in the environment that's already going on. Because you're going to be there for 15 minutes or an hour at the most, and then you're going to leave. And they're living in a cloud of whatever's going on with them. And then in Galatians chapter 6:2, Paul writes, bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. So when we share in someone else's pain, or we share our pain with someone else, we share in the mourning process and the difficult process and the struggling process. But then when God brings that comfort, we also share in the comfort. We've got a friend who got diagnosed with cancer like 2 weeks after he got married a couple years ago. And he's better now. And when they called us with that news, oh man, I'm getting teary just thinking about that. The fact that he got over it and that he could start to put some weight back on and get back to normal life. And about a month ago, it was a month ago today, I think, we were over at the graveyard, standing over the grave of our friend Fabiola, who was 13 years old when she died of leukemia. And when we got that call, that's a holy thing. To come alongside somebody and say, what are you going through? Oh yeah? I'm going to go through that with you. And it's a really important way in which we share in God's holiness as we imitate Christ and reflect that holiness outward for the salvation of the world. And that's what Jesus did for us. And that's what we can do for each other. Now, I want to say this. There are people here, right here, obviously my wife, but there are other people here who have been next to me through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. David and I can joke about stuff that I've been through in a way that actually makes me feel better. Abby and I can joke about stuff that I've been through. We've also joked about stuff that each other have been through in a way that actually makes us feel better. And that kind of dark humor thing is not for everybody, but it's something that I definitely rely on in order to get through what I need to get through. My wife has been there, and every morning when I wake up, she reads my face to see how the day is going to go. And that makes that woman a saint. And I don't say that lightly, because that, going through it with somebody, is actually holy. And the word saint means a holy one of God, set aside for God's purpose and set aside for God's use. And so God put her in my life and put me in her life so that we could go through these things with each other in the imitation of Jesus Christ. And that is a holy thing. And your spouse and your friends and your boyfriend and your girlfriend and your kids and your parents and the people that you worship with are in your life for that holy reason, so that we can bear each other's burdens and suffer what we suffer together, so that we know that we're not alone, and so that we can feel the presence of God through another person who's going through that with us. And so the next time you get an opportunity, the next time you ask someone how they're doing, and they say, not that good, and you give them an opportunity to talk to you about what they're feeling and about what they're going through, don't be in a rush to fix it. And don't try to impose how you feel onto them. Just listen, because listening is enough. Jesus came, and as he's walking through the crowd, he's listening to their hurts, and he's listening to their pain, and he's listening to their struggles. And he also has this power from God to heal their bodies as he walks around. We don't have that power to just touch someone and remove everything that's wrong with them. But we do have the power that he had to be there with somebody and to listen to them and to bear their suffering with them. All of us are capable of that if we can make that sacrifice and actually pay attention to somebody and not make it about us for a little bit of time. And what I want us to understand is that is holy work, because that's what God sent Jesus into the world to do, and that's what Jesus sends us into the world to do in our relationships. And yeah, we get dirty doing that. It's uncomfortable, and it's hard, and it hurts. But it's holy work, and that's what makes us people who follow and imitate Jesus Christ.